This is a short story by Oscar Cook called When Glister Walked. Now, it's set in Borneo, and there's a few terms which we're not familiar with in everyday language. I'll try to explain most of these as we go through the story, but I'll explain one now. It's the word tuan, spelt T-U-A-N. Now, a tuan is a sort of master or sir. It's a very respectful term, a lord, if you like, someone who's in charge of a community. Here we go. Dennis, district officer of the Audiobook district in British North Borneo, had been spending a few days local leave on Tingling Estate, for Walkley, the manager, and he were great friends. The night before his departure, the two men had sat together in the latter's mosquito room, fitted up like a den, and with pipes well lit, had roamed in desultory manner over many fields of conversation. For the last 10 minutes or so, there had been silence between them, the silence of friends in complete accord. Dennis broke it. "Throw me a match, Wally," he said. Walkley moved as though to comply, and then stopped as his boy entered, carrying a tray containing whisky and soda, which he placed on a table near his master. He was about to depart when Walkley spoke. "The Tuan is leaving tomorrow before breakfast, Amat. Tell Cookie to make some sandwiches and see the thermos flask is filled with hot tea." "Tuan?" "And hand these to the Tuan." Walkley pointed to the matches. Amat obeyed and went out. Walkley rose from his long chair, mixed the drinks and held out a glass to Dennis. "To our next meeting," he said, and raised his glass. Dennis followed suit. Then, yawning, Dennis rose and, stretching his arms well above his head, looked sleepily in the direction of his bedroom. Walkley nodded assent and held open the mosquito door. A few minutes later, the house was in darkness, save for the lights that shone through the open windows of the two bedrooms. The rooms were on either side of a large dining room, which in turn opened out from the main veranda, off one side of which was built the mosquito room. At the far end of the dining room were two folding doors that led to a passage and pantry, and thence down some steps to the kitchen and boys' quarters at the rear of the house. As Dennis undressed, he sleepily hummed the latest foxtrot record received from England. Then, dimming the light, he got into bed. From where he lay, he could hear Walkley moving about his room, and could see the reflection his light cast on the exposed atap roof of the house. Atap are dried sago leaves, and that was the covering of the roof. As he idly watched, speculating dreamily on Wally's success as a manager, Walkley's lamp in turn was lowered. Followed the creaking noise of a body turning on a spring mattress, then silence. Dennis rolled from his left to right side, preparatory to sleep. "Nighty-night, old thing," he grunted. "Night," came back the sleepy reply. Then all was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of the rubber trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. Presently, Dennis awoke to full alertness. He was not strung up. No sound, nor fear, nor nightmare had aroused him. He was simply and quietly awake. Turning on his side, he looked at his watch. The hands pointed to 2 a.m. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not be wooed. For a long time, Dennis lay in the nearly darkened room, watching the waving branch of a rubber tree outside the window that moved gently to the sighing of the breeze. Suddenly, he heard the sound of feet ascending the steps that led from garden to veranda doors. But half awake, he listened. Slowly, the footsteps mounted the stairs. Then came the lifting of the latch that fastened the low wooden gates, and the creaking of moving hinges. The footsteps entered, continued the full length of the veranda to pass into the dining room beyond. Here, for a moment, they halted. Then they moved again, shuffling uncertainly forward, backward, sideways, as those of a person trying to locate something in the dark. Again they moved with steady tread and reached the intervening doors that shut off the passage. Dennis listened and waited. What the devil was old Wally doing? He sleepily wondered. A sudden rush of cool air struck him over the top of the bedroom wall, billowing out his mosquito net. Creak, 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 the doors were opening. The footsteps went along the passage and came to a standstill at the end. "Boy!" The call was clear and decisive, but Dennis failed to quite recognise the voice, though he realised it was a European's. There came no answer. "Boy!" This time the call was sharper, and impatience was in its tone. Still no reply. In the silence, Dennis, wondering greatly, waited, for he was still uncertain whether the voice was Walkley's or another's. The footsteps sounded again as they descended the stairs that led to the servants' quarters. On the bottom step, they halted. "Boy!" The call was long, loud, and angry, yet still no answer came. Up the stairs, the footsteps returned. They strode along the passage, paused as the doors were closed and the latch clicked, then swiftly moved through the dining room out onto the wide veranda. Here, for a moment, they rested. Sounded the fumbling for a latch, the squeak of a faulty hinge, and from the sharp banging of a door, Dennis knew the footsteps had entered the mosquito room. He sprang out of bed and, sitting on its edge, hurriedly pushed his feet into his slippers. Then, as he was about to move, the lamp in the room went out. "Damn!" he muttered, and fumbled for his matches. But before he found them, he was listening to the opening and shutting of drawers. He struck a match, and by its light crossed to the lamp, the wick of which, however, refused to burn, though he wasted many matches upon it. In the gathering darkness, for the moon was setting, he moved toward the door, but with his hand upon the knob stood still, for the footsteps were shuffling again, and the sharp banging to of the mosquito door made him jump. Through the veranda the footsteps went, gaining sureness with every stride. The gates creaked and the latch fell to. Down the stairs the footsteps clumped, the sound growing fainter till it became lost in the night. 3 deep-toned notes from the office gong boomed on the air. Dennis shivered, kicked off his slippers, and returned to bed. The air was cold, so he drew his blanket well around him. "Old Wally's walking in his sleep, or else indulging in a midnight prowl," he muttered. Half a minute later, he was sound asleep. As Dennis's eyes opened to the beauties of a tropic dawn, the clink of silver spoons against china reached his ears, and the scent of a cigarette crept into the room. He plunged his head into the basin of cold water, brushed his hair, and still in his sarong and kabaya went out onto the veranda, where Walkley paused in the act of conveying a cup to his mouth. "Morning, Dennis," he grunted, and continued drinking his tea. I mentioned sarong and kabaya. A kabaya, they're just sleeping garments. He was never very talkative first thing in the morning. Dennis answered and busied himself with the teapot. Then, under cover of meticulously choosing a piece of toast, he studied Walkley, who showed no signs of having spent a sleepless night. Suddenly, Walkley looked up and caught Dennis's eye upon him. "Well?" he asked. "What is it?" "Nothing," Dennis curtly replied. "Then why look at me like that?" "Sorry, old thing," Dennis stammered. "I was only wondering." "Yes?" "What the devil were you up to last night, walking all over the house and shouting for your boy?" "Then you heard it too?" Walkley asked the question with relief. "It? What's it?" Dennis retorted. "Didn't I hear you come up the veranda steps, open the gates and walk into the back? You called boy 3 times but got no answer. Then you walked back through the house and down the steps. What was wrong, Wally?" Walkley looked Dennis full in the eyes as he slowly answered. "Nothing. Nothing was wrong. And I never moved from my room till this morning." But then who the—" "I never moved," Walkley repeated. "What you heard was Glister." "Glister? What on earth do you mean? Who's Glister?" "You know, the chap who was manager here before Bellamy. He shot himself, died in your room, on your bed. He's buried in the garden at the foot of the hill below your window. Great pity, but drink and a native woman. Nice chap too." Walkley ceased as the light of recollection shone on Dennis's face. "Yes, I remember," he spoke almost to himself. "I met him once as a Jesselton race meeting. A tall, good-looking fellow." Walkley nodded, and Dennis continued. "He was awfully keen on a beautiful native woman, a Doosan named Jebby." "Yes, she was lured away from Glister by another man. It was a dirty thing to do. The swine! I only have—" "You needn't worry," Walkley interrupted. "He rues the day all right, I'll bet, for she's got him body and soul, doped to the eyes, and her temper is that of a fiend incarnate. She's a priestess, too, of the Goosey, and he daren't call his soul his own. So poor old Glister's loss was really his gain, if only he'd known." Dennis's words were gently spoken. "Yes, but he felt her absence, and in the loneliness that followed, the drink got to him again." For nearly a minute there was silence between the two. It was as if their memories had recalled Glister's spirit to his old home, almost as if he were sitting at the table with them, with the tinkling of Jebby's anklets sounding from an adjoining room. Dennis broke the silence. "And you mean that was he last night?" he asked. "Yes." The words seemed drawn reluctantly from Walkley's lips. "But good Lord, man, you don't mean... You can't... It's preposterous." "I know," Walkley spoke slowly. "It sounds absurd, doesn't it? But old Bellamy went through it, saw him and spoke to him, and once even shot at him." "Bellamy? Bellamy shot him?" "Yes, and there isn't much mysticism about him. He's as much imagination as a turnip." "But all the buts in the world won't alter matters. Bellamy's seen him, I've seen him, and you've heard him. He's there, and it happens, and it's always the same. Only—" "What?" The word was wrung from Dennis. "He's never entered the mosquito room before." "You think—" "I don't know. How can I? I'm only wondering why he went there, what he was searching for." "Drink, perhaps." Walkley shook his head. "No," he said. "The room wasn't built in his days. No, there's something worrying him, something that's caused this variation in his usual walk." His eyes met Dennis's, and he gave a short, half-ashamed laugh. Then, "Get on with your tea. When you've finished, we'll go and look at his grave. I always inspect it twice a month and put a coolie on cleaning it up and looking after the flowers. We'll have a look today." As Dennis dressed with unusual slowness, his mind was full of the tragedy so strangely recalled. "Poor old Glister," he muttered. "What an end." An impatient call roused Dennis from his reverie, and he hastened to the veranda to find Walkley already on the garden steps, conversing with Gaga, the head mandor of many years' standing. A mandor is like a sort of overseer. The three at once set off. Down well-laid cement steps, along a broad path that wound among a profusion of bright-coloured flowers they went. Overhead, a flaming sun rose in an azure sky, and a faint breeze fanned their faces with its cooling breath, perfumed with the scent of dew and the fragrant elusive blossoms of the rubber trees. At the foot of the hill they turned and went in single file along a narrow path that followed the winding contour of the hill. The three walked in silence, for speech was difficult along that narrow track. Suddenly the path, dipping down, turned sharply, and Walkley, who was leading, became for an instant lost to view. Dennis, humming a Doosan love song, followed close behind, but as he reached the turn, the tune died abruptly on his lips, and he stood stone still. "Good Lord, what can it mean?" The words were gasped by Walkley, who stood transfixed, staring with horror-struck eyes straight before him. Instinctively, Walkley turned to Dennis, who, like himself, stood with gaze fixed and staring eyes. "What can it mean?" he gasped a second time, for they had reached the grave, and it was open. Heaped under the railings surrounding it, which were intact, were piles of fresh dug earth, and all round lay the scattered flowers, withered and trampled into twisted shapes. The eyes of Dennis and Walkley met. In each there lurked a question that neither dared to ask. Each heard again the shuffling footsteps of the previous night, and the opening and shutting of the drawers in the mosquito room. A shadow fell across them as they stood. There came a startled cry, the quick pattering of bare feet, and Gaga flung himself upon his knees, burying his hands in the earth. "Gaga!" The word was a sharp command of outraged wrath, but the man did not heed, and his hands continued fumbling, fingering, searching. Walkley stooped down to seize the kneeling Mandor by the shoulder, then straightened up as the latter rose, and turning, showed a face pallid under the yellow of his skin, from which stark horror shone. "The Padang, Tuan!" he gasped. "The Padang! It has gone!" Walkley looked at him in stupefaction. "Gaga!" he began, but got no further, for the man, heedless of Walkley's upraised hand, broke in. "The Padang, Tuan! The silver Padang that Jebby used to wear as token of her priesthood of the Gusi has gone. The silver Padang is no more." He ceased, and for a moment there was silence among the three. On Walkley's face there showed a blank amazement, but Dennis's brows had gathered in a frown, and his lips had closed in a deep straight line. He was the first to speak. "Walkley," he said, "may I ask Gaga questions?" Walkley nodded his assent, and Dennis turned to Gaga. "Gaga, tell me, what makes you say the silver Padang is no more?" "Because," Gaga stammered in his emotion, "because when Tuan Glister was buried, the Padang was buried too. And now?" His gaze sought for the coffin for a moment, and he fingered a charm of monkey's teeth that hung round his neck. "Tell me, Gaga," Dennis voiced. "Tell me, Gaga. Tell me, Gaga." Dennis' voice was very gentle. "All you know. Begin at the beginning." Just before we hear Gaga's story, a padang is a silver buckle. Now, when he starts his story, we're going to hear a few more words. A niai is a native housekeeper, and Sabah is their name for their own country. Sabah is Borneo. Let's return and hear Gaga's story now. Gaga looked relieved, for a native resents questioning and loves to tell a story in his own way. "The Tuans know," he began, "that Tuan Glister had a niai named Jebby. She came to him when she was very young, but vowed by the oaths of her parents to the priesthood of the Gusi, the sacred jars we Dusuns worship, which only our womenkind may tend. But she was young and beautiful and full of life. Her beauty was unmatched in all this land of Sabah. Her form was lithe, her footsteps light, her waist was small. Yet she was vowed in wifehood to a jar, the sacred Gusi. Her lips and eyes, though warring with her blood, were innocent of love, till Tuan Glister visited the village in search of coolies for the estate. Then," Gaga paused, seeming for a moment at a loss to find his words. "Then the Tuan was tall and handsome and possessed golden hair. He had a laughing, winning way, and eyes that darted here and there and made the warm blood race within your veins when once his glance had rested on you. His eyes discovered Jebby, and—" Gaga looked nervously from Dennis and Walkley as he shuffled his feet, frightened of saying too much concerning a white man before others of his race. Dennis read the meaning of his glance. "Yes, Gaga, you may speak," he said. Tuan Bessar and I are friends, and we would give Tuan Glister's wandering spirit peace. Say all that is in your heart. We understand. Tuan. Garga's tone conveyed a depth of grateful meaning. That night there was dancing and feasting in the village, and pitcher after pitcher of tapai was consumed. Tapai is like a fermented liquor. The Tuan drank too, but none could stand against him, and one by one they sank into a heavy sleep. Only the Tuan remained. He left the headman's house and, going through the village, reached Jebi's home. It was that darkest hour before dawn, when the chill wind blows, yet she was seated on the topmost step. The light of the dying moon seemed focused on a silver buckle she wore hung from a rotan girdle round her waist. Their eyes met. No word was said. The Tuan stretched out his arms, and Jebi went to him, and the Tuan's arms enfolded her. Garga ceased. The silence lengthened till the office gong, booming 8 deep notes, shattered the spell. "How do you know all this, Garga?" Walkley asked at length. "You never mentioned it before." A look of surprise flitted over the Mandor's face. Then he quietly replied, "The Tuan never asked me my story before, nor is it customary for the white man to discuss others of his race with natives. How do I know? Why, Tuan Bessar, was I not present on that night? And is not Jebi my sister, though of a different mother? The Tuan had saved my life, and Jebi was young. The warm blood danced in her veins, and her heart cried out for a mate. And so the river, Tuan, flowed far from the village. The Tuan's boat was there. All in the village slept. The Tuan led her to the boat, while I stole up the steps, entered the house, and made a bundle of her clothes. Then to the waiting boat I followed. The Tuan had covered Jebi with his coat, and she was sleeping, but the silver buckle hung round his neck, and from that day it never left him. We 3 were alone in the boat. The Tuan and I picked up the paddles, and as their blades in silence touched the water, the moon slipped beneath the earth, and the burung bantu hooted thrice. An evil omen which the Tuan heeded not, and Jebi did not hear. Till the sun was high we paddled, and by noon were far beyond pursuit, for river flowed very swiftly, and one does not wake early from such a sleep as those in the village were sleeping. Garga paused, then he added, "The rest of the story the Tuans know." For a little while the Tuan and Jebi were happy, but the omen of the burung bantu and the dying moon would not be denied, and the shadow of the goosey lay between them. So though the Tuan loved her, he drank too deeply, and she found favour in another's sight, and went away. But the Tuans know the rest. I buried him. There was no white man on the estate, and as he died, he made me promise to bury the buckle with him, hanging round his neck. It was the only thing of Jebi's that he kept. "And now?" Dennis put the question sharply, and his eyes held Garga's gaze. "I am afraid, Tuan. So afraid." "Of what?" "I do not know, and the silver padang has been stolen, though its hiding place was unknown. To none has it value save to my people, and for years now they have let it rest. But, Tuan, they never forget, and the goosey is most sacred. In the great blue jar that Jebi used to tend and should have wedded Maboga, the bad spirit dwells. Of late evil has befallen my people. The buffaloes bring forth no young, and the crops refuse to ripen. So, Tuan, I am afraid. Gaga ceased, and once again a silence fell upon the three. Suddenly it was broken by the hurrying footsteps and laboured breathing of a man who ran, and round the bend appeared an upas. All three looked up at his approach and saw stark fear upon his face. "Tuan! Tuan!" he gasped. "Tuan Glister cannot be found. His house is empty, and his bedroom disarranged, and on the floor is a pool of blood." His eyes caught sight of the open grave. The words faltered on his tongue, then ceased, and he stood silent, trembling like a leaf. At the mention of that name, Dennis started, but before he could speak, Walkley answered the question, hovering on his lips. "Young Glister's my new assistant, Dennis." He spoke in a queer, strained voice. "He only came last month. You haven't met him yet. But he's a younger brother of—" Walkley looked toward the grave. "It's horrible," he muttered. In a flash, the meaning of the rifled grave and Glister's disappearance grew plain, and the frown on Dennis's face grew deeper, and his lips grew more compressed. Heedless of Walkley's questionings, of the gibbering Opas, he turned to Gaga. "Gaga," he said, "I see the hand of Mabago stretching out, seeking revenge for the insult of years ago. His arm is long. It stretches from the Tuan's grave to a village in the hills. Is it not so?" "Tuan," Gaga answered. "It stretches," Dennis continued, "from the village to the new Tuan's house. As well, for what the white man took must be repaid with interest. What think you, Gaga?" "That the Tuan is wise and reads the Dawson as a book." Dennis, Walkley had dismissed the Opas and, putting out his hand, grasped Dennis's arm. "Dennis," he cried, "what do you mean Glister's disappeared? There's blood upon his floor, and we stand here while heaven knows what devil's work is being done. What do you mean, with interest?" "Listen, Walkley." Dennis weighed his words and spoke with slow conviction. "I'm in the dark almost as much as you, but I know the Dawsons and the fetish of their goosey worship. When Glister took Jebby from her people, she broke their vows and outraged the sacred jars. But while the years were plentiful and their calves were strong, they did not worry. When as now the inevitable lean year comes, they seek a reason for their troubles." "You mean," asked Walkley, still perplexed. "That reason is Merboga. They think he will not be appeased unless—" Dennis did not finish, but his glance wandered to the open grave and back to Walkley's strained white face, on which the dawning light of comprehension showed. "Good heavens," he muttered. "You really think that—" Dennis nodded, then turned to Gaga. "Gaga," he said, "tell me exactly what happens at the feast." "The silver buckles of the priestesses, Tuan, are hung upon the goosey's lips. Then, when the dying moon is halfway set, the mateless wives say prayers and wash the sacred jars and call upon the spirits to come forth and give their judgment on the village for the year. This year, I think Maboga's jar will once again be decked. But who will cleanse the sacred lips, I cannot think. For while Jebby lives, the padang may be worn by no one else. Tuan Glister dared and paid the price." "And Maboga?" Dennis's voice was low, almost a whisper. For a moment Gaga hesitated, then he replied, "The Tuan himself has said, what the white man took must be repaid with interest." He paused, then he added, "A white man's head has never yet hung in a Dawson house, but 3 days hence Maboga will decide." The eyes of Dennis and Walkley met. Both seemed to hear again the shufflings in the night, the opening and shutting of drawers. Both understood the object of that search. "I'll borrow Glister's revolver, Wally, for we'll go alone with only Gaga as our guide and attend this feast," said Dennis. For hours the booming of gongs had been borne upon the breeze, yet though the three had been steadily ascending, the deep-toned notes still sounded far away. On the crest of a hill, Dennis and his companion halted for a brief rest. Then onward and upward the trio climbed, while the track grew narrower and stonier, and the jungle pressed closer on every side, and long trailing thorn-edged creepers hanging from the trees whipped their faces and tore their clothes. The leading beast stopped, and Gaga raised his hand. Without a word, the two white men drew level, for the path had widened out, and they stood upon the border of a glade dissected by a muddy stream, whose banks were scored with a myriad hoof marks. Gaga slipped from his animal and softly spoke. "We are nearly there, Tuan. This is their grazing ground, but all the animals are at the village, for all have ridden to the feast." Dennis nodded and proceeded, like the others, to tether his beast. Then, on foot, the three moved forward, but with a quicker pace, for the gongs were loudly booming with a beat that would not be denied. Even as they crossed the muddy stream, the swaying rhythmic time, rising and falling with the cadence of a dance, gave place to an insistent note that rose and rose till only one intense vibration, one single throbbing note beat on the heavy air with a malignant strength, sapping all kindly thoughts and fanning the flame, the primal lusts of hate and vengeance. A little farther, and the path rose with a sudden precipitousness that forced them to mount the well-worn stones as though they climbed a stair. They reached the top to stand upon a tiny plain on which the shadows of the encircling trees were slowly lengthening. Even as they rested to regain their breath, that one insistent note ceased, and for an instant silence reigned. Then, from the glade's farther end, arose a cry, faint at first, then slowly louder, harsher, stronger, swelling to a mighty paean, to a tumultuous cry, "Maboga! Maboga! Aki Maboga!" And the stillness once again, save for the hurried padding of running feet as the three raced across the shadow-flecked glade. Panting, they reached a wall of jungle, pierced by a sudden path that twined its short length through the heart of a moss-clad hill whose riven sides were lit with weird, fantastic lights thrown from countless torches that burned on a plateau at its end. In the shadow of a belt of trees, they paused to take stock of their surroundings. The plateau formed a horseshoe, and at its apex stood a native house built 8 feet off the ground, whose length stretched 300 feet. At either end, leading to the only doors, were rough-hewn steps carved from solid logs of timber, and from these steps arose 2 poles, 6 feet in height, between which was stretched a length of knotted rotan. From this, like a gruesome necklace, hung 2 rows of ghastly human heads, blackened and dried from the smoke of years, save at each end, and there hung 2 heads with staring, sightless eyes and bared lips exposing whitened teeth, and from them the red blood dripped. Upon the ground, placed in a semicircle, stood the jars, the sacred gusi, ranged in accordance with their height and rank. From either end they tapered up towards the central spot where, side by side, rose 2 of the flaming blue that reached the height of a man's shoulder. The rim or lip of each was of a different hue, one black, one white, while from the neck of those whose lip was black grew 4 large ears, and in the lobes of each was placed a human skull. Behind each jar, save one, a woman stood, her thick black hair piled high upon her head, framing her lime-washed face, from which her dark eyes shone. Her figure, swathed from chin to toe in shrouded black, girt at the waist with a girdle of mice and monkeys' teeth. A silver padang hung under the lip of every jar but one, and and resting on its swelling shoulder, shimmered and winked in the torch's fantastic light. Facing the jars, the Dusans sat in rows, immobile and intent. There shone upon the face of everyone a strained expectancy, showing the taut muscles of the back and the restless twining fingers of the hands. Thus they waited in that strange, uncanny silence for the answer to their cry.
Maboga, Maboga, Akai Maboga.
Almost forgetful of the purpose of their errand, Dennis and Walkley watched, fascinated by the scene before them, lit by the waning moon and the lurid flickering torches. Something of its primeval instincts and the tension of the squatting natives crept into their veins and held them spellbound as they gazed upon the coloured jars with their glittering, shining buckles, each with its dumb attendant, white-faced woman backed by the long, unbroken shadow of the palm-roofed house. While the moon sank slowly in the west until its lower rim began to kiss the topmost ridge of the roof, the silence lengthened, till it seemed as if nature slept, and those rows of squatting natives were graven images devoid of breath. But all at once there came a creaking sound, and the tension snapped. A long, rippling murmur, half sigh, half gasped, filled the air, and Gaga's hand gripped Dennis's arm. "Look, Toan, look!" he whispered, and pointed to a hut which stood alone and almost hidden in the shade of a mighty billion tree. The two men obeyed, following the line of Gaga's pointing finger. The hut door opened slowly as the noise increased, but though no light burned within, a shadowy form was faintly visible moving toward the glade. Slowly, silently, though still half hidden by the shade, the form drew near. Then, as all eyes were turned upon it, a glinting speck of light winked in the gloom. And as the figure moved, the winking light moved too. Slowly, steadily, from the shade into the flickering fringe of torches, from the fringe into the full lurid glare moved the figure and the light. A quick intake of many breaths, a long loud gasp of terrified surprise, then silence. And a woman, with a silver buckle hanging from a girdle round her waist, stood before the great blue sacred jar, from under whose deep black lip no silver buckle hung. Over the silence that like a living spirit lay upon the glade, Gaga's excited whisper just reached Dennis's and Walkley's ears. "Tuan, it is Jebi, and she wears the silver padang that I buried in Tuan Glister's grave. Tuan, Tuan, I am afraid." Even as he spoke, the woman raised her rounded arms, on which no gleaming bangle shone, and with a single gesture unloosed the coils of her high-wound hair. The long, thick tresses fell around her like a black cloak. Again she raised her arms, this time in supplication, and her low, clear voice went chanting through the glade.
Akai Maboga, of the sacred Gusi, spirit of evil who dwelleth in the great blue jar, hear now thy erring daughter, thy forsworn priestess, and forgive. Here in my shame I stand before thee and the assembled people, bearing the silver padang, symbol of thy might and power, which in my youth and wilful love I disgraced. Thou, who for long hast been neglected, till thy wrath just burst into flame, so that the crops no longer ripen, and the herds cease to bring forth their young. Lift, I beseech thee, Akai Magwoga, the shadow of thy anger from my race. Through me, and for my sin, my people have been punished. Through me, O Akai, pronounce the penance thou dost claim.
She ceased, and as a willing cry rose from the assembled natives, slipped slowly to her knees, and flinging her arms round the great jar's neck, rested her lips upon its blackened rim. Walkley stirred, but Dennis's warning hand bade him keep still. Gaga, speechless and with bulging eyes, stared at the kneeling figure. A wind was stirring in the trees. The moon had sunk completely out of sight, and here and there a flickering torch gutted and burnt out. Thus, in the creeping darkness they waited, while the moments grew to minutes, burdened with suspense, waited for Maboga's answer that his deep black lips would whisper in Jebi's listening ear. At length, with infinite grace, she rose and stood clothed in her long black hair behind the great blue jar, for on its swelling shoulders, glinting against its deep black lip, the silver padang lay. The wind was sighing in the trees. The rustling leaves made soft accompaniment to her voice, which trembled with emotion.
My lips have kissed the sacred goosey. My tears have watched its deep black lip. The silver padang has returned to deck the shrine of the Great Spirit who has spoken, for my ears have caught his whispering breath.
A murmur rose, then faded, and she continued.
Rejoice, O people, for I see the crops on the hillsides ripening and the herds with their young. But for his clemency, Maboga asks a price.
She paused, then stretching out her arms, cried in a ringing voice,
What will you give, my people, to allay your desperate plight?
Quick as the summer lightning, swift as an adder's tongue, came the answer from those rows of waiting natives.
What the white man took, let him repay with interest. The head of the white man's brother we will give as makepeace to Maboga, and as thy wedding gift.
She raised her hand, and there was silence.
Thy words are good, thy offering acceptable unto...
Her words were drowned in the great shout of fear as a lighted torch fell from its bamboo socket onto the palm-roofed house. Like running water fanned by the rising breeze, the flames spread rapidly till, in the twinkling of an eye, the wooden house was nothing but 300 feet of sheeted flame. Then pandemonium reigned, and terror stalked the glade. But to the watching three, the fire was providential, for the burning house lit up the hut, till now hidden in the gloom, and at its single window they beheld young Glister's blood-stained face. Under the shadow of the trees, skirting the edge of the tiny plain, they raced. A few more yards, and they would reach the door. Another second, out of the shadows by the hut, a naked figure sprang, her long black hair streaming in the breeze, a glittering, sharp-edged sword in her hand. With an oath, Walkley forged ahead, but missing his footing on a twisted root, stumbled and fell. The sudden, instinctive tightening of his fingers, a flare and sharp report, a cry of pain, a sagging, drooping form, and Jebi lay, a crumpled figure, across the threshold of the hut.